Today we're talking about the darkest episodes from Cartoon Network. Let's get started. So, first we are talking about one bad thing about every Steven Universe character. Steven. Steven Universe is way too naive, and his constant need to fix everyone puts people in danger. While fans love Steven for being kind and hopeful, the truth is that his refusal to see the world for what it really is has made situations worse and put both him and his loved ones in serious danger. He thinks every problem can be solved with hugs and talking, even when dealing with literal war criminals and aliens who want to destroy Earth. The return shows Steven's dangerous naivety at its worst when actual threats arrive on Earth. When Jasper, Peridot, and Lapis show up in their warship to destroy the planet, Steven's first thought is to try to make friends with genocidal aliens. Even as the crystal gems are desperately getting ready for battle and evacuating the town, Steven keeps thinking he can somehow talk his way out of this situation. The most telling moment in this episode is when Steven insists on staying to help fight, because he really believes his presence will somehow make everything better. He tells the gems, "I'm a crystal gem too," and throws himself in front of a massive energy blast, nearly getting himself killed. His shield saves everyone in that moment, but only by pure luck. Steven had no way of knowing he could summon a shield that big. What makes Steven's behavior so dangerous here is that he's operating on pure wishful thinking. He doesn't have a plan, he doesn't understand the situation, and he doesn't listen to the people who actually know what they're dealing with. The crystal gems try over and over to get him to safety because they understand that this is a war situation, not a friendship problem. But Steven's naivety makes him think that his good intentions and pure heart will somehow be enough to stop an invasion. The episode ends with Steven being captured by Jasper, who is genuinely confused and disgusted by what she sees as rose quartz hiding in a child's body. Steven's naivety has put him directly in the hands of someone who wants to kill him, and he still doesn't seem to understand how serious the situation island. His refusal to see these aliens as genuine threats has made him a problem for everyone trying to protect him. Alone Together shows how Steven's naivety creates problems even in supposedly safe situations. When Steven and Connie accidentally fuse into Stevonnie, Steven's immediate reaction is excitement and wonder, rather than any thought about what this means or what problems it might cause. He doesn't think about whether they're ready for this, whether it's safe, or what might happen next. Steven's naivety shows most clearly when Stevonnie goes to the rave and attracts unwanted attention from Kevin. Steven's part of the fusion is completely unprepared for how adults might react to Stevonnie's appearance and behavior. He's so focused on the fun and wonder of fusion that he doesn't think about that Stevonnie looks like an attractive teenager and might attract predatory attention. When Kevin starts hitting on Stevonnie and making them uncomfortable, Steven's naive part of the fusion doesn't know how to handle the situation. He's never had to deal with this kind of adult manipulation before, and his innocent worldview hasn't prepared him for someone who might have bad intentions. Connie has to be the one to recognize that something is wrong and get them out of the situation. The episode shows how Steven's naivety can put him and others in danger even when he thinks he's just having innocent fun. His inability to see potential problems or recognize when situations are inappropriate creates risks that more experienced people have to help him navigate. His good intentions don't protect him from the consequences of his poor judgment. Mindful education reveals the deeper problems with Steven's naive worldview by showing how it affects his mental health and relationships. Throughout this episode, Steven struggles with guilt over having to fight Bismuth, Jasper, and Eyeball, but his guilt comes from his naive belief that he should have been able to save them all through kindness alone. Steven's hallucinations during fusion training show how his naivety has set him up for psychological trauma. He's convinced himself that violence is never necessary and that every problem can be solved through understanding and compassion. When reality forces him into situations where he has to choose between protecting innocent people and trying to redeem villains, his naive worldview collapses and leaves him unable to cope. The most telling part of this episode is how Steven reacts to his past conflicts. Instead of recognizing that he made the best decisions he could in impossible situations, he tortures himself with guilt because his naive beliefs told him there should have been a peaceful solution to every conflict. His refusal to accept that some people choose to be harmful has left him unprepared for the moral complexity of real-world situations. Steven's breakdown during the fusion shows how his naivety has actually made him weaker, not stronger. His inability to accept that sometimes violence is necessary to protect innocent people has left him psychologically fragile when faced with the consequences of his actions. He's so committed to his naive worldview that he'd rather suffer than acknowledge that the world sometimes requires difficult choices. Steven's dangerous naivety consistently puts the crystal gems in impossible positions throughout the series. They constantly have to choose between protecting Steven and doing what's necessary to keep Earth safe. His naive belief that everyone can be redeemed forces them to take unnecessary risks and spend time and energy on hopeless causes instead of focusing on real threats. In the return, the gems have to split their attention between fighting off an invasion and keeping Steven safe from his own poor judgment. His insistence on staying in danger means they can't focus entirely on the battle, potentially putting everyone on Earth at risk. His naivety turns him from a potential asset into a problem that actively makes their job harder. Steven's naive approach to conflict resolution also enables genuinely harmful people to continue causing damage. His refusal to accept that some gems are beyond redemption means he keeps trying to help people who are actively working to hurt others. This wastes precious time and resources that could be used to protect innocent people instead. Maybe most dangerously, Steven's naivety teaches bad lessons to other people, especially other children who look up to him. His insistence that kindness and understanding can solve any problem sets people up for disappointment and potential harm when they encounter situations that actually require firm boundaries or decisive action. Steven's naivety also prevents him from developing the emotional and practical skills he needs to handle real-world problems. Because he approaches every situation with the same naive optimism, he never learns to read situations accurately, set appropriate boundaries, or recognize when someone is genuinely dangerous. This leaves him constantly unprepared for the complexities of adult life and real conflict. The most frustrating thing about Steven's naivety is how it often makes him ignore or dismiss the wisdom and experience of people who actually know better. In The Return, he ignores the crystal gems' warnings about the danger they're facing. Throughout the series, he consistently acts like his good intentions matter more than other people's expertise and experience. Steven's naive worldview also makes him incredibly self-centered, even though he thinks he's being selfless. His insistence on trying to redeem everyone is about maintaining his own comfortable belief that the world is fundamentally good and that he can fix everything. He's more committed to preserving his naive worldview than he is to actually helping people in practical ways. This self-centeredness shows up in how Steven handles other people's trauma and boundaries. He often pushes people to forgive their abusers or give second chances to people who have hurt them because it makes Steven feel better about the world. His naivety makes him put his own emotional comfort over other people's safety and healing. Steven's naivety also makes him a poor judge of character and situation. He consistently fails to recognize red flags, dismiss warning signs, and trust people who have repeatedly proven themselves to be harmful. This puts him and others in danger because he can't accurately assess threats or make informed decisions about who to trust. The sad thing about Steven is that his naivety, which he thinks makes him special and good, actually makes him worse at helping people and protecting the things he cares about. His refusal to see the world clearly means he's constantly surprised by problems he should have seen coming and unprepared for situations that smarter people could handle better. Steven's naivety also stops him from growing up emotionally. Because he refuses to deal with how complicated moral situations really are, he never learns the thinking skills he needs to make good decisions in tough situations. He stays stuck in a childish black and white view of the world that doesn't warrant naivety makes him unk when he faces harder challenges. Most seriously, Stev reliable when things get dangerous. When real threats show up, people can't count on him to make good decisions because his judgment is clouded by his naive beliefs. The show acts like this is his greatest strength, but it's actually his biggest weakness. Until Steven learns to balance his compassion with realistic thinking and accept that some people choose to be harmful, he'll continue to be a problem for the people he's trying to protect. Steven's naivety puts everyone at risk, but Garnet's cold distance leaves them to suffer without support. Garnet. While fans love Garnet for being wise and composed, she's actually emotionally distant when people need her most. Instead of providing comfort and understanding, Garnet treats emotions like problems to solve with logic. Her detached approach is fear of vulnerability that hurts the people around her. When crises hit, Garnet shuts down emotionally, leaving others to handle their trauma alone while also taking care of her. Keeping it together shows Garnet's emotional detachment at its most damaging. When she and Steven discover the forced gem fusions in the kindergarten, horrific experiments where shattered crystal gems were forced together against their will, Garnet's first reaction is complete emotional shutdown. She literally freezes up and stops functioning entirely. What makes this so problematic is that Steven is right there with her, experiencing this trauma too, and Garnet completely abandons him emotionally. Steven is a child who just witnessed something genuinely horrifying, and instead of comforting him or explaining what's happening, Garnet just shuts down. She leaves Steven to defend both of them while she has her breakdown, forcing a kid to be the adult in an incredibly traumatic situation. When Garnet finally does react, it's not to comfort Steven or address his needs, it's to have her own emotional crisis. She starts separating into Ruby and Sapphire, basically having a public meltdown, while Steven is still fighting off the fusion monsters around them. Even in her moment of vulnerability, Garnet is completely self-absorbed and unable to consider how her behavior affects others. The worst part is how she handles the aftermath. Instead of talking to Steven about what they experienced together, processing the trauma, or helping him understand what happened, Garnet just goes back to her usual composed self and acts like everything is fine. She completely ignores Steven's emotional needs and never addresses how terrifying it must have been for him to see her fall apart when he needed her most. Logdate 7152 reveals how Garnet's emotional detachment affects her relationships with the other gems, particularly when dealing with Peridot's integration into the group. Throughout Peridot's logs, we see Garnet consistently failing to connect with Peridot on an emotional level, even though Peridot is clearly struggling with major life changes and identity issues. When Peridot is trying to understand Earth culture, making mistakes, and clearly feeling lost and confused, Garnet's responses are always practical rather than empathetic. She corrects Peridot's behavior without addressing the underlying emotional needs that are driving that behavior. When Peridot accidentally pushes Greg off the roof, Garnet focuses on explaining the rules about human fragility rather than helping Peridot understand why her actions matter or how they affect others. Most tellingly, when Peridot tries to understand fusion by attempting to fuse with Garnet, Garnet treats it like a technical exercise rather than an emotional experience. She doesn't help Peridot understand the emotional vulnerability that fusion requires, or acknowledge how scary it must be for someone who's never experienced that kind of emotional intimacy. She just goes through the motions, and when Peridot backs out, Garnet acts like it's no big deal. The episode shows how Garnet's emotional distance makes her ineffective at helping people through difficult transitions. Peridot needed emotional support and understanding as she adapted to a completely new way of life, but Garnet only provided practical guidance. This forced Steven to fill the emotional support role that Garnet should have been providing, putting unfair pressure on a child to do the emotional labor that an adult should handle. The answer shows how Garnet's emotional detachment extends even to sharing her own story and history. When Steven asks about her origins, Garnet is reluctant to open up and only tells the story because her original plan fell through. Even when she does share, she tells it like a history lesson rather than a personal story about her own experiences and feelings. Throughout her retelling of Ruby and Sapphire's first meeting, Garnet maintains emotional distance from her own story. She describes traumatic events, IPM, being sentenced to death, fleeing for their lives, having their entire worldview shattered, in the same calm, detached tone she uses for everything else. She never acknowledges how painful or scary these experiences were, or how they continue to affect her. What's particularly problematic is how Garnet frames the story's emotional climax. When Steven asks what the answer was, Garnet simply says love, without any deeper explanation or emotional context. She reduces one of the most important experiences of her existence to a single word, refusing to share the actual emotional complexity of what Ruby and Sapphire went through or how it felt to become Garnet. This emotional withholding robs Steven of the chance to really understand Garnet and connect with her experiences. He's clearly hungry for that deeper connection and understanding, but Garnet's detached storytelling style keeps him at arm's length even when she's supposedly opening up to him. Garnet's emotional detachment consistently hurts the people around her, especially Steven, who often looks to her for guidance and emotional support. Her inability to provide comfort, understanding, or emotional validation forces other people to either suppress their own emotional needs or find support elsewhere. In keeping it together, Steven has to process horrific trauma essentially alone because Garnet is too emotionally shut down to help him. This teaches Steven that emotions are dangerous and that he can't rely on the adults in his life to support him through difficult experiences. It also forces him to take on a caretaker role for Garnet during her breakdown, which is completely inappropriate for a child. Garnet's emotional distance also makes her a poor leader when it comes to team dynamics and morale. She can make strategic decisions and give orders, but she can't provide the emotional support that keeps a team functioning well under stress. This puts extra pressure on Pearl and Amethyst to handle the emotional labor of the group and often leaves everyone feeling isolated and unsupported. Perhaps most damaging, Garnet's emotional detachment models unhealthy emotional behavior for Steven. She teaches him that the mature way to handle emotions is to suppress them, stay in control, and prioritize logic over feelings. This sets Steven up for serious emotional problems later as he tries to handle increasingly complex situations while suppressing his own emotional needs. Garnet's detachment also prevents her from growing and developing as a character. Because she refuses to engage with emotions deeply, she never learns better ways to handle difficult feelings or support others through emotional challenges. She stays stuck in the same patterns of emotional avoidance, which means she can't become a better friend, leader, or mentor. Her inability to be emotionally present also limits the depth of her relationships. While people respect Garnet and value her practical guidance, they can't form truly close bonds with someone who won't share their inner emotional life or provide emotional support when needed. This keeps Garnet isolated even within her own team. The most frustrating thing about Garnet's emotional detachment is that it often makes situations worse rather than better. Her refusal to acknowledge or address emotional realities doesn't make them go away. It just forces other people to deal with those emotions without support. In keeping it together, her emotional shutdown created a crisis that Steven had to manage, making an already traumatic situation even more difficult. Garnet's detachment also makes her unreliable during emotional emergencies. When people are having breakdowns, processing trauma, or dealing with major life changes, they can't count on Garnet to be emotionally present or supportive. This creates additional stress for everyone else who has to pick up the slack. Perhaps most seriously, Garnet's emotional distance makes her unable to recognize when others are struggling emotionally until they're already in crisis. She misses early warning signs and doesn't provide preventive emotional support that could help people avoid reaching their breaking points. This means problems often escalate unnecessarily because Garnet doesn't intervene early enough. Garnet's emotional walls come from genuine trauma, but they've trapped her in a cycle where she can't grow or heal. By staying fused, Ruby and Sapphire avoid their individual fears while accidentally teaching Steven that suppressing emotions is mature behavior. The irony is that Garnet has incredible wisdom from her experiences, but her detachment makes it useless to people who need emotional support. She gives practical advice when people need comfort, and stays composed when they need someone to share their pain. Garnet could be an amazing mentor if she learned that vulnerability is what creates real connection. Her strength would mean so much more if it came with emotional presence instead of emotional absence. Garnet shuts people out when they need her most. But Amethyst does something just as harmful. She never grows up, forcing others to clean up her mess. But before I tell you about Amethyst, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Amethyst. Amethyst is the crystal gem who never grew up. While fans love her for being the fun one, the truth is that Amethyst's constant immaturity and refusal to take responsibility hurts everyone around her. She treats life like a game where nothing matters and serious talks are just boring interruptions. This is childish behavior that stops her from being the person Steven and the other crystal gems need her to be. Tiger Philanthropist perfectly shows how Amethyst's immaturity hurts people who care about her. When she and Steven start wrestling together, it begins as harmless fun, but Amethyst treats their partnership like a toy she can throw away when she gets bored. The moment wrestling stops being instantly fun for her, she quits without thinking about Steven's feelings at all. Her dramatic exit is pure selfishness, disguised as personal growth. Amethyst announces she's over this and walks away, leaving Steven confused and hurt in front of an angry crowd. She doesn't talk to Steven about her feelings first, doesn't try to end things nicely, and doesn't seem to care that wrestling meant something different to him than it did to her. The way she just drops the championship belt and grabs the microphone to make her announcement shows how little she thinks about anyone else's investment in what they built together. For Steven, wrestling was their special thing, a bond they shared that made him feel closer to Amethyst. When Steven tries to keep wrestling alone as Tiger Philanthropist, giving away money and changing his whole persona, Amethyst stays away and lets him deal with the mess she created. She's perfectly fine letting him struggle with confused fans and an identity crisis that stems directly from her abandonment. Steven even has to deal with Lars's disappointment about Tiger Millionaire's new direction, but Amethyst doesn't care enough to check in on him or see how he's handling the transition. She only comes back when she realizes Steven is about to give away their championship belts because she suddenly decides their memories matter to her again. Her return speech about how their wrestling times meant everything to her rings hollow when you remember she walked away from those same memories without a second thought just episodes earlier. This shows Amethyst's biggest problem. She wants all the good parts of relationships without any of the hard work. She'll jump into projects and partnerships when they're fun, but the second they need real effort or get complicated, she's ready to run away. On the Run shows where Amethyst's avoidance comes from, but also proves how her immaturity makes everything worse. When Steven suggests they live like homeless kids from his book, Amethyst immediately loves the idea because she's running away from uncomfortable feelings about where she came from. Instead of dealing with her complicated emotions about being made at the kindergarten, Amethyst chooses to escape. She's happy to drag Steven along on her emotional running away trip, encouraging him to leave his home and responsibilities just because she's in a bad mood. The train hopping sequence shows how unprepared Amethyst is for real consequences. When Steven gets hungry and realizes his small bindle couldn't carry enough food, Amethyst has already eaten all her own supplies. She didn't plan ahead or consider that their adventure might involve actual hardships. When Steven gets attacked by a raccoon twice, Amethyst just laughs instead of helping or taking the situation seriously. She's treating Steven's discomfort and fear like entertainment rather than recognizing that she's put a child in a potentially dangerous situation. When Pearl finds them at the kindergarten and tries to handle things carefully, Amethyst responds by having a complete meltdown. Instead of talking to Pearl like an adult or helping Steven understand what's happening, Amethyst gets violent. She physically attacks Pearl while Steven watches, which traumatizes him and makes an already tough situation much worse. The fight scene is particularly brutal because Amethyst keeps escalating when she could choose to walk away or ask for space to calm down. The worst part is how Amethyst acts like Pearl is the bad guy for not understanding her pain, but Amethyst never tried to tell anyone how she was feeling. She kept her problems secret, let her anger build up, then exploded when it got too much. During the fight, she screams about how she never asked to be made and calls herself a parasite, but these are feelings she's been carrying alone instead of sharing with people who care about her. Her accusation that Pearl sees her as an embarrassment comes out of nowhere from Pearl's perspective, because Amethyst never gave any indication she was struggling with these thoughts. This is classic kid behavior, avoiding the hard emotional work until problems become disasters, then blaming everyone else for not reading your mind. Even when Pearl tries to apologize and explain her side, calling Amethyst the one good thing that came out of this mess, Amethyst can barely accept it nicely. She's so stuck thinking of herself as the victim that she can't see Pearl's real attempts to make things better. Steven has to watch this whole emotional mess and even gets physically knocked around during their fight because Amethyst couldn't handle her feelings like a grown-up. Reformed shows Amethyst's immaturity in a different but equally annoying way. When she gets poofed by the monster, each time she comes back should be a chance to improve herself, but instead Amethyst treats it like dress-up time. Instead of using the experience to grow or get better, she acts like it's all a joke. Her first comeback gives her 4 legs instead of arms, which she acts like is no big deal. When Garnet worries about her rushing through it, Amethyst gets defensive and dismissive, doing cartwheels and making jokes instead of listening to legitimate concerns. The episode also reveals how Amethyst handles criticism in general. When Steven tries to get her to take a personality quiz, she gives obviously false answers and acts bored when the questions get too personal. She can't even handle a silly online quiz asking about her insecurities without deflecting and making jokes. This pattern shows up throughout the episode anytime someone tries to get her to reflect seriously on herself or her choices, Amethyst shuts down or turns it into a game. The second comeback is even worse. Amethyst deliberately turns herself into a mean copy of Pearl, complete with fake fancy talking and sarcastic comments. This is cruel and childish. While they're supposed to be hunting a dangerous monster, Amethyst is using her comebacks to make fun of Pearl and settle petty arguments. She mimics Pearl's mannerisms in an exaggerated way, makes jokes about organizing rocks by shape and color, and talks about needing everyone's constant approval. It's particularly nasty because it turns Pearl's genuine personality traits into objects of ridicule. When Garnet calls her out for being ridiculous, Amethyst can't handle any criticism, even when it's obviously right and coming from someone who cares. She immediately gets defensive and starts yelling about how Garnet wanted her to be more like Pearl, and now she island. But that completely misses the point of what Garnet was trying to tell her about taking regeneration seriously. The third comeback is the most telling. Amethyst creates a lopsided, unstable form with huge muscles, desperately trying to prove she's strong enough while completely missing what Garnet was actually worried about. She's so focused on winning the argument and avoiding being vulnerable that she literally hurts herself, trying to prove she doesn't need to change. When her bulky arm starts failing during the fight with the monster, she still refuses to let go or ask for help, insisting that Garnet wanted her to be stronger. Only when Steven points out that she doesn't want to think about herself does Amethyst finally stop playing games. The fact that a simple comment from a kid is what finally gets through to her shows how much energy Amethyst puts into avoiding looking at herself honestly. Even then, it takes her 4 hours to regenerate properly, longer than she's ever taken, suggesting that genuine self-reflection is incredibly difficult for her. Amethyst's immaturity is especially bad because Steven looks up to her and gets caught in the middle of her poor choices. In Tiger Philanthropist, Steven has to clean up the mess when Amethyst abandons their partnership, dealing with disappointed fans and trying to figure out a new wrestling identity on his own. In On the Run, he watches a violent fight between two of his parent figures because Amethyst couldn't handle her emotions like an adult. In Reformed, he has to be the voice of reason while Amethyst plays games during a dangerous situation. Steven shouldn't have to be more emotionally mature than one of his guardians, but Amethyst constantly puts him in that position. She treats him like a friend, instead of someone she's supposed to protect and guide. This is an adult giving up her responsibilities and forcing a child to make up for her emotional problems. Amethyst's immaturity also teaches Steven bad ways to cope. When he sees her avoiding problems through jokes and deflection, running away from difficult conversations, and refusing to take responsibility for her choices, he learns that these behaviors are okay. What makes Amethyst's immaturity so frustrating is how little she actually learns from these episodes. In Tiger Philanthropist, she comes back at the end, but only after Steven has already dealt with the consequences of her abandonment. She says sorry for quitting, but doesn't seem to understand why her approach was hurtful or promised to handle future situations better. In On the Run, she accepts Pearl's apology and they hug it out, but there's no sign that Amethyst has learned better ways to handle her emotions or talk about her needs. Reformed ends with Amethyst finally taking regeneration seriously, but only after making everyone else miserable with her games. Her refusal to take emotional complexity seriously means fights get worse than they need to be, important conversations get avoided until they become disasters, and Steven gets exposed to adult problems without proper help or explanation. Most importantly, Amethyst's refusal to grow up means she can't give Steven the kind of guidance and stability he needs from a parent figure. Instead of being someone he can turn to for wisdom and support, she's often just another problem he has to manage or worry about. Amethyst avoids responsibility by acting like a child, but Pearl is even worse. She hides behind control and turns her trauma into a weapon. Amethyst runs from her problems by pretending nothing matters, but Pearl deals with hers by forcing everything to matter way too much. Pearl. Pearl is the crystal gem who desperately needs everything to go according to her plan. While fans often praise her as the responsible one who keeps everyone organized, the truth is that Pearl's obsessive need for control consistently damages her relationships and puts people in danger. She can't trust anyone else to make decisions, can't handle when things don't go perfectly, and treats other people like obstacles to manage or tools to use for her own emotional needs. Mirror Gem shows Pearl's control issues at their most basic level. When she gives Steven the mirror as a teaching tool, she expects it to work exactly as she planned, show him gem history and educate him properly. But when the mirror doesn't respond to her commands, she immediately dismisses it as broken rather than investigating why it might not be working. Pearl can't handle the idea that something might not function according to her expectations, so she just writes it off and moves on. When Steven discovers that the mirror can communicate, Pearl's first instinct is fear that something is happening outside her control. She immediately declares that the mirror should just be following orders and can't accept that it might have its own will or needs. This reveals Pearl's fundamental approach to relationships. She believes things and people should behave predictably according to her understanding of how they're supposed to work. The moment Garnet tries to take the mirror away from Steven, Pearl doesn't step in to mediate or try to understand Steven's emotional attachment to his new friend. Instead, she supports Garnet's decision because it restores order and removes the unpredictable element from the situation. Pearl would rather see Steven lose something important to him than deal with the uncertainty of a mirror that doesn't follow the rules she expects. When Steven accidentally slaps Garnet and runs away with the mirror, Pearl's response is telling. She doesn't go after Steven immediately to comfort him or try to understand why he was so upset. She stays to manage the situation with Garnet, treating Steven's emotional crisis as a secondary concern to maintaining team stability. Even when they do go looking for Steven, Pearl seems more focused on retrieving the mirror than on addressing Steven's feelings about the whole situation. When Steven finally frees Lapis Lazuli from the mirror, Pearl's reaction is pure panic. She immediately summons her weapon and treats Lapis as a threat, even though Steven is clearly trying to protect her. Pearl can't process the idea that the situation might be more complex than she originally understood, or that Steven might have done something genuinely helpful by freeing someone who was trapped. Cry for Help reveals the truly manipulative side of Pearl's control issues. When Peridot's signal starts broadcasting again, Pearl sees an opportunity to fuse with Garnet as sardonyx and immediately begins plotting how to make it happen repeatedly. Instead of being honest about her desire to fuse, Pearl decides to secretly rebuild the communication hub herself, so they'll have to keep destroying it. This plan requires Pearl to lie to everyone repeatedly. She has to pretend to be surprised when the signal appears, act concerned about Peridot's continued threats, and fake ignorance about how the hub keeps getting repaired. Pearl is so desperate to control when and how she gets to fuse with Garnet that she's willing to deceive her entire team and waste their time on fake missions. The worst part is how Pearl frames her deception. When she's finally caught, she tries to justify her actions by saying she just wanted to share a few more victories with Garnet. She acts like her motivation was innocent and sweet, but that completely ignores the manipulation and lies required to make it happen. Pearl wanted something specific, so she orchestrated an elaborate scheme to get it while making everyone else think they were dealing with a real threat. Pearl's control issues also put the team in actual danger. While they're wasting time destroying the communication hub over and over, Peridot is actually out there somewhere, potentially building other threats or calling for backup. Pearl's selfish need to control her fusion experiences with Garnet actively undermines their mission to protect Earth. She's so focused on getting what she wants that she loses sight of the bigger picture. When Garnet confronts Pearl about the deception, Pearl still tries to control the narrative. She doesn't take full responsibility for her actions. Instead, she tries to minimize them by focusing on her emotions rather than the consequences. She wants Garnet to understand her feelings and forgive her, but she doesn't really acknowledge how her dishonesty affected everyone else or put their mission at risk. Sworn to the Sword shows Pearl's control issues at their most dangerous. When Connie asks to learn sword fighting, Pearl doesn't just teach her basic techniques, she immediately tries to mold Connie into her own image as Rose Quartz's devoted knight. Pearl can't separate her own experiences from Connie's situation, so she projects all her trauma and obsession onto this young girl. Pearl's training is about recreating the dynamic she had with Rose through Connie and Steven. She tells Connie that she's nothing compared to Steven, that her only value comes from protecting him, and that she should be willing to die for him. This is psychological conditioning designed to turn Connie into Pearl's vision of what a knight should be. The song "Do It For Her" reveals just how deeply Pearl's control issues have warped her understanding of healthy relationships. She genuinely believes that complete self-sacrifice and devotion are normal and desirable, so she tries to instill these same unhealthy patterns in Connie. Pearl is essentially grooming Connie to have the same obsessive, self-destructive relationship with Steven that she had with Rose. Throughout the training, Pearl dismisses Steven's concerns and discomfort. When he tries to participate or express worry about Connie's safety, Pearl shuts him down and insists that her way is the only correct approach. She can't accept that Steven might have valid input about his own protection or that Connie might benefit from a more balanced training style. Pearl has decided how things should work, and she won't tolerate any deviation from her plan. The fog training sequence shows Pearl's control issues at their most extreme. She creates an environment where Connie has to fight alone in confusing conditions while Steven stumbles around helplessly. This is Pearl manufacturing a situation that proves her point about Connie needing to be Steven's sole protector. She's manipulating the training scenario to validate her own beliefs rather than actually preparing Connie for real threats. When Steven and Connie work together to defeat the Hollow Pearls, Pearl gets angry that they're not following her prescribed roles. She can't handle the idea that her training plan might be flawed or that there might be better approaches to protection and combat. Pearl would rather see them fail according to her methods than succeed using different ones. The moment when Pearl accidentally calls Steven Rose during their argument reveals the true source of her control issues. She's not really training Connie to protect Steven, she's trying to recreate her relationship with Rose Quartz through them. Pearl is so trapped in her past that she can't see Steven and Connie as their own people with their own needs and capabilities. Pearl's control issues particularly damage her relationship with Steven. In Mirror Gem, her inability to handle unexpected situations means Steven has to deal with complex emotional and magical problems without proper guidance. In Cry for Help, her deception creates trust issues and forces Steven to witness a painful conflict between two of his parental figures. In Sworn to the Sword, her projection of trauma onto Connie puts Steven in the horrible position of watching someone he cares about being trained to sacrifice herself for him. Steven consistently tries to communicate his needs and concerns, but Pearl either dismisses them or manipulates situations to override his input. She claims to want to protect and teach him, but she's actually preventing him from developing his own judgment and decision-making skills. Pearl's control issues make her unable to see Steven as a capable person who can participate in his own protection and growth. Pearl's need for control also damages her relationships with the other crystal gems. In Mirror Gem, she supports Garnet's heavy-handed approach rather than advocating for a more understanding response to Steven's attachment. In Cry for Help, she manipulates Garnet's trust and wastes everyone's time with fake emergencies. Her control issues make her an unreliable team member who prioritizes her own emotional needs over group effectiveness. What makes Pearl's control issues so frustrating is how little insight she has into her own behavior. In Cry for Help, she seems genuinely surprised that Garnet is angry about the deception, as if her intentions should matter more than her actions. In Sworn to the Sword, she has to be explicitly confronted with the parallel between her relationship with Rose and what she's creating between Connie and Steven before she begins to understand the problem. Pearl's control issues stem from her deep insecurity and trauma around Rose's death, but that doesn't excuse her behavior. She uses her pain as justification for manipulating others and refusing to trust their judgment. Instead of working through her issues in healthy ways, she tries to control external situations to manage her internal emotional state. Her need to control everything ultimately leaves her more isolated than if she learned to trust others and accept that things don't always go according to plan. Pearl controls everyone around her because she's terrified of chaos, but Connie controls nothing around her because she's terrified of herself. Connie Maheswaran constantly doubts herself despite proving her worth over and over again. While fans often praise her as Steven's brave and loyal partner, the truth is that Connie's fear of not being good enough holds her back and creates problems when quick action is needed most. She's so busy questioning whether she belongs that she often becomes useless when people need her to step up. This is crippling insecurity that puts herself and others in danger. Nightmare Hospital shows Connie's self-doubt issues at their worst. When she finally decides to bring her mother into her secret life with Steven and the gems, she immediately starts panicking about whether she made the right choice. Instead of confidently explaining the situation or taking charge of introducing her mom to this new world, Connie becomes paralyzed by worry about how everything will go wrong. When they run into the cluster mutants in the hospital, Connie's first reaction is to freeze up and doubt whether she should even be there. She's so busy questioning her own abilities that she becomes completely useless when her skills are most needed. Steven and her mother have to handle the dangerous situation while Connie has a breakdown about whether she's worthy of being there. The worst part is how Connie acts like her hesitation is being careful and thoughtful, but she's actually just scared of making mistakes and being judged. When her mother starts asking reasonable questions about the dangerous situations Connie has been putting herself in, Connie doesn't defend her choices or explain her thinking. Instead, she immediately starts doubting everything she's been doing and wondering if she's been fooling herself about her abilities. Even when Connie finally does take action and help solve the crisis, she can't enjoy the victory or feel good about what she did. She's immediately back to questioning whether she handled things right and looking for approval from Steven and her mother. This shows that Connie's fear of not being good enough is a basic inability to trust herself or see her own skills. The hospital episode also shows how Connie's insecurity affects her relationships. Her mother spends the whole episode worried about Connie's safety and trying to understand what kind of dangerous world her daughter has gotten involved in. Instead of being able to calm her mother's fears with confidence and proof of her training, Connie's own doubts make her mother's worries seem more reasonable. Connie's insecurity makes other people doubt whether she really can handle the responsibilities she's taken on. Sworn to the Sword shows Connie's self-doubt fears from a different angle, but the pattern is the same. When Pearl starts training her in sword fighting, Connie immediately decides that she needs to prove herself worthy of Steven's friendship and the gem's acceptance. She doesn't approach the training as learning new skills or personal growth. She treats it as a test she has to pass to earn her place in their world. Throughout her training, Connie pushes herself to dangerous limits because she's terrified of being seen as weak or not good enough. When Pearl tells her that she's nothing compared to Steven, Connie accepts this toxic message because it matches her existing fears about her own worth. A person with healthy confidence would recognize that Pearl's training ideas are messed up, but Connie's self-doubt issues make her vulnerable to this kind of mental manipulation. The song Do It For Him shows how deeply Connie's fear of not being good enough has twisted her understanding of her relationship with Steven. She doesn't want to be his partner or equal, she wants to be his devoted protector who proves her worth through self-sacrifice. This is trying to manage her own insecurities by making herself necessary through extreme devotion. When Steven tries to train alongside her and suggests they work as a team, Connie initially fights against it because teamwork doesn't fit her story of needing to prove herself. She's so focused on showing that she's worthy of Steven's friendship that she can't see how her obsession with proving herself is actually hurting their relationship. Steven wants a partner, but Connie's self-doubt issues make her think she needs to be his bodyguard instead. Even after they resolve the training conflict and Steven convinces her that they should fight together, Connie still struggles with feeling like she deserves to be his equal partner. She agrees to work as a team, but her underlying fear that she's not good enough continues to show up in future situations. Mindful education gives another clear example of how Connie's self-doubt fears create problems. When she and Steven try to master fusion as Stevani, Connie's worries about a completely unrelated incident with a classmate start messing with their ability to stay fused. She can't put aside her personal insecurities enough to focus on what they're doing, which puts both her and Steven at risk during their training. The butterfly incident that triggers Connie's anxiety is telling because it shows how her fear of not being good enough goes beyond her relationship with Steven and the gems. She accidentally hurt a classmate during a moment of panic, and instead of handling it properly at the time, she ran away and has been carrying guilt and shame about it ever since. Her self-doubt issues make her unable to deal with normal human mistakes in healthy ways. When Connie's anxiety causes Stevani to fall from a dangerous height, it becomes clear how her personal emotional problems can create serious safety issues. Steven has to deal with not only the physical danger, but also Connie's emotional crisis, which splits his attention and makes the situation more dangerous for both of them. Connie's inability to manage her own insecurities becomes Steven's problem to solve, even in life-threatening situations. Dewey Wins shows how Connie's self-doubt issues affect her ability to keep relationships working when things get complicated. After Steven returns from his space adventure, Connie is hurt that he didn't tell her about his dangerous plan beforehand. But instead of directly talking about her feelings or working through the conflict, Connie shuts down and starts avoiding Steven completely. Her reaction is about her fear that maybe she doesn't matter to him as much as she thought she did. Rather than trusting in their friendship and talking about the issue directly, Connie immediately jumps to the conclusion that Steven doesn't value her input or see her as a real partner. Her self-doubt fears turn a manageable relationship problem into a long period of silence and avoidance. When Steven tries to reach out and apologize, Connie initially pushes him away because she's still caught up in questioning her own importance to him. She needs lots of reassurance and validation before she can move past her hurt feelings, which puts an unfair emotional burden on Steven. He has to not only apologize for his original mistake, but also manage Connie's insecurities about her overall worth in his life. Connie's self-doubt issues particularly impact Steven, who often has to serve as her emotional support and confidence booster. In Nightmare Hospital, Steven has to encourage her to act when she freezes up during the crisis. In Sworn to the Sword, he has to convince her that she doesn't need to sacrifice herself to prove her worth. In Mindful Education, he has to help her work through her anxiety while also managing his own stress about their dangerous training. This creates an unequal relationship where Steven is constantly responsible for managing Connie's emotional state in addition to dealing with his own problems and responsibilities as a half-gem with magical powers and family. Trauma. Connie's self-doubt issues mean that Steven can't rely on her for emotional support in the same way she relies on him because she's always questioning whether she's qualified to help or give advice. Connie's fear of not being good enough also limits her growth as a character. Because she's so focused on proving herself worthy rather than simply improving her skills and confidence, she approaches challenges from a place of fear rather than curiosity or excitement. This makes her less likely to take healthy risks or push herself in productive ways. Her self-doubt issues also make her resistant to feedback or helpful criticism because she interprets any suggestion for improvement as proof that she's not good enough. When Garnet gives her advice about fusion or Pearl suggests changes to her training, Connie often takes these comments as personal attacks rather than helpful guidance. The most frustrating thing about Connie's self-doubt issues is how disconnected they are from reality. She's consistently shown to be brave, smart, skilled with a sword, quick thinking in crises, and loyal to her friends. She successfully handles dangerous situations, learns complex magical concepts, and adapts to extraordinary circumstances that would overwhelm most people. But despite all this proof of her skills and value, Connie continues to doubt herself and seek validation from others. Her self-doubt fears seem immune to evidence that contradicts them, which suggests that they're more about her internal emotional patterns than actual assessment of her abilities. This creates a frustrating viewing experience, where the audience can clearly see Connie's strengths and contributions, but she remains trapped in cycles of self-doubt that prevent her from enjoying her successes or building real confidence. Connie's fear of not being good enough affects the group dynamics when someone consistently doubts their own abilities and needs constant reassurance. The group has to spend time and energy managing Connie's insecurities instead of focusing entirely on their missions or enjoying their relationships. Her self-doubt becomes a form of self-sabotage that limits her potential and creates unnecessary drama that everyone else has to deal with. Connie's self-doubt hurts the team, but Greg's parenting is what made Steven too soft to lead. Greg Universe loves his son so much that he's accidentally stopping Steven from growing up. While fans praise Greg as the caring, supportive father, the truth is that his constant protection and spoiling prevents Steven from learning important life lessons. Greg treats Steven like he's fragile, keeping him away from any difficulty that might actually help him mature. This is emotional babying that leaves Steven unprepared for real challenges. Greg the babysitter shows Greg's basic approach to responsibility and reveals how little he understands about actually taking care of someone. The flashback episode shows young Greg struggling with adult responsibilities while dating Rose, but instead of learning from these experiences, he carries his immature attitudes into fatherhood. When he babysits Sour Cream, Greg treats it like a fun adventure rather than a serious job involving a child's safety. Greg's decision to take baby Sour Cream to the beach shows his complete lack of understanding about proper childcare. While putting sunscreen and sunglasses on the baby shows some awareness of safety, Greg's overall approach treats Sour Cream like a prop in his and Rose's beach fun, rather than a child who needs constant watching. When Greg and Rose run off to play in the waves, they're basically abandoning their responsibility to watch the baby so they can have their own fun. The worst moment comes when Greg gets distracted by Rose's philosophical talk about human growth and decides to leave Sour Cream with her while he goes to write down lyrics. This decision shows Greg's real priorities. When faced with choosing between his creative interests and his childcare responsibilities, Greg picks his music without hesitation. He treats Rose like a built-in babysitter rather than recognizing that she has no experience with human children and might not understand how to keep them safe. When Greg returns to find that Rose has allowed Sour Cream to climb to the top of a Ferris wheel, his panic shows that he does understand the danger, but only after the fact. Rose's explanation that she watched Sour Cream climb reveals how poorly Greg explained what watching a child actually means. He assumed Rose would automatically know how to keep a baby safe without giving her any guidance about what childcare actually involves. The Ferris wheel incident perfectly shows how Greg's casual approach to responsibility creates dangerous situations. His decision to trust Rose with Sour Cream without proper instruction nearly results in serious harm to the baby. When Greg has to climb the Ferris wheel to rescue Sour Cream, he's dealing with the consequences of his own failure to take the babysitting job seriously from the beginning. Even after this near disaster, Greg's takeaway seems to be more about his own personal growth, I am a baby, than about learning to be more responsible with other people's safety. The episode frames this as Greg learning to grow up, but his approach to raising Steven suggests he never really learned these lessons about the importance of structure, boundaries, and protective oversight. What's particularly telling is how Greg handles the aftermath of the Ferris wheel incident. Instead of having a serious conversation with Rose about child safety or reflecting on how his own negligence created the dangerous situation, Greg just makes a joke about being a baby himself. This pattern of deflecting serious moments with humor, rather than engaging with the real lessons, shows his fundamental immaturity. The test shows how Greg's overprotective tendencies have shaped Steven's development and created problems for the Crystal Gems. While Greg doesn't appear directly in this episode, his influence on Steven is clear throughout the story. Steven's desperate need to prove himself and his devastation at learning he failed an easy test reflects the kind of confidence issues that develop when a child is constantly shielded from failure and challenge. The episode reveals that Steven has been having problems with his healing powers ever since Greg faked an injury, which shows how Greg's well-meaning lies have actually damaged Steven's magical abilities. Greg's decision to pretend to be hurt rather than honestly discussing Steven's powers created confusion and self-doubt that's now interfering with Steven's development as a gem. This pattern of avoiding difficult truths to protect Steven's feelings has clearly backfired. The Gem's decision to create a fake test for Steven stems partly from their recognition that he needs another success to rebuild his confidence. This suggests that Steven has been struggling with self-doubt and needs constant validation to feel good about himself. Classic signs of a child who hasn't been allowed to experience real challenges or develop genuine toughness. Greg's protective approach has left Steven fragile and dependent on others' approval rather than building real confidence. When Steven discovers that the test was rigged and overhears the gems discussing how they don't know what he needs, it becomes clear that Greg's overprotective parenting has left everyone unsure how to help Steven develop properly. The gems are trying to make up for Steven's lack of resilience and confidence, but they're struggling because Steven hasn't been prepared for real challenges through normal childhood experiences. Steven's decision to pretend he didn't know the test was fake shows how much he's learned to manage other people's emotions rather than expressing his own honest feelings. This kind of emotional caretaking behavior often develops in children who've been overprotected and learned that their negative emotions upset the adults around them. Instead of being able to honestly express his hurt and anger, Steven feels responsible for keeping everyone else comfortable. Say Uncle demonstrates Greg's conflict avoidance and his tendency to let Steven handle adult problems rather than stepping in to provide guidance. While the episode is played for comedy, it still reveals Greg's patterns when Steven encounters something he doesn't understand. Greg's absence during the chaotic events with Uncle Grandpa shows how he often leaves Steven to navigate complex situations without parental support. Throughout the episode, Steven has to figure out how to handle the gem's fear and aggression toward Uncle Grandpa without any adult guidance about managing conflict or communicating effectively. This reflects a broader pattern in Steven's life where Greg's hands-off approach means Steven often serves as the mediator in adult conflicts rather than being protected from them. The episode also shows Steven's advanced emotional intelligence and conflict resolution skills, which are impressive for a child but also concerning because they suggest he's been forced to develop these abilities out of necessity. Children who grow up managing adult emotions and conflicts often become skilled at peacekeeping but miss out on the chance to just be kids who are protected and guided by responsible adults. Greg's overprotective approach particularly impacts Steven's relationship with the crystal gems and his development as a half-gem. Because Greg shields Steven from difficult experiences, Steven enters gem missions and magical situations without the resilience and problem-solving skills he needs to handle genuinely dangerous scenarios. The gems end up having to constantly worry about Steven's emotional state and confidence rather than being able to train him effectively. Steven's healing power problems after Greg's fake injury show how Greg's protective lies have real consequences for Steven's magical development. Gem powers seem to be connected to emotional clarity and confidence, but Greg's pattern of deception and overprotection has created confusion and self-doubt that interferes with Steven's abilities. Greg's attempts to protect Steven from emotional pain have actually made him less capable of handling the responsibilities that come with his powers. Greg's overindulgence also shows up in his reluctance to set boundaries or enforce consequences with Steven. He treats Steven more like a friend than a child who needs structure and guidance. While this creates a warm, affectionate relationship, it also means Steven doesn't learn important lessons about responsibility, consequences, and self-discipline that he needs as he grows up. The most frustrating aspect of Greg's overprotectiveness is how it creates more problems than it solves. By constantly shielding Steven from difficulty and disappointment, Greg has made him more vulnerable to emotional distress rather than more resilient. Steven's devastation at failing an easy test shows that he hasn't developed healthy ways of dealing with setbacks because Greg has prevented him from experiencing age-appropriate failures and challenges. Greg's approach also puts unfair pressure on the crystal gems to make up for Steven's lack of emotional resilience. They have to constantly manage Steven's confidence and self-esteem, rather than being able to focus on actually training him for the dangerous situations he'll face. This creates additional stress for everyone and makes the team less effective overall. Greg's overprotectiveness comes from genuine love and his own difficult experiences. He clearly adores Steven and wants to give him the happy, carefree childhood that he himself may have lacked. However, good intentions don't change the fact that his approach hurts Steven's development. Children need to experience age-appropriate challenges, failures, and consequences to develop resilience and problem-solving skills. The most damaging long-term effect is that Greg teaches Steven to prioritize other people's comfort over his own authentic feelings. Steven learns to manage everyone else's emotions rather than expressing his own, which sets him up for serious problems as he faces more complex challenges. Real protection means preparing children for difficulties, not shielding them from every possible source of growth. Ultimately, Steven Universe shows that even the most well-meaning characters can cause real harm when they're stuck in their flaws. That's a lesson worth remembering, no matter how magical the world might seem. Now we will talk about Regular Show's most terrifying episode finally solved. What if I told you that Regular Show's most disturbing episode has been hiding a secret for over a decade? You know the one I'm talking about. Hello Governor, that British taxi nightmare that makes you want to skip it every time it comes up in a rewatch. Most fans just write it off as the weird episode, but I think they're missing something huge. See, I've been obsessed with this episode for years. I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out. There's something about Hello Governor that doesn't add up. It's too different, too specific, too psychologically disturbing to just be a random horror parody. And after going down this rabbit hole deeper than I probably should have, I think I finally cracked the code. This episode is actually a blueprint, a psychological profile that predicted every major breakdown Rigby would have for the next 6 seasons. It's like the writers accidentally created a character study so accurate that it became a roadmap for his entire arc. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. But before we dive into the conspiracy, let's break down what actually happens in this episode, because I guarantee you missed some details that change everything. It starts innocently enough. Mordecai and Rigby are having movie night, and Rigby's picked something different from their usual comfort viewing. Instead of Shy Guy, their go-to film, he's rented Hello Governor, this old black and white British horror movie about a possessed taxi. Already, red flag number 1. Rigby actively choosing psychological horror over something safe and familiar. This is someone deliberately poking at his own fears. Mordecai immediately objects, and here's where it gets interesting. He specifically mentions that, "Last time I had to walk you to the bathroom every night for a week," so this isn't Rigby's first horror movie breakdown. There's a pattern here that the episode establishes right from the start. Rigby has a history of not being able to handle scary content, but he keeps seeking it out anyway. They watch the movie, and it's genuinely horrifying. A British taxi possessed by its murdered driver hunts down gang members, appearing in impossible places, bursting through classroom windows, emerging from shower curtains, consuming an old man and spitting his bones out the exhaust pipe. This is straight nightmare fuel, and the episode doesn't wink at the audience about it. Mordecai falls asleep and dismisses it as cheesy when he wakes up. But Rigby is completely traumatized. And here's where things get really weird. What follows is 8 minutes of psychological horror that feels completely disconnected from regular show's usual tone. Rigby starts seeing the taxi everywhere. Outside his window, in his dreams, where he's transformed into Fists, a tough guy who still gets hunted down by those glowing headlights. The sound design, the visual choices, the pacing, everything shifts to create genuine dread. Mordecai tries to help through exposure therapy, literally holding Rigby in front of the TV for days, screaming, "Look at it, look at it," while pointing out boom microphones to prove the movie's fake. But nothing works. They're both completely exhausted by the end of this sequence, and Rigby is getting worse, not better. Then comes the cricket match scene, which is where I think the episode tips its hand about what's really happening. They go to expose Rigby to real British people, hoping it'll help. But every single person they meet greets him with "Hello, Governor," and their faces appear demonic and threatening to Rigby's paranoid perception. And then, the impossible happens. The actual taxi from the movie shows up. Now, here's the thing. The episode plays this completely straight. There's no comedy beats, no winks to the audience that this is absurd. From Rigby's perspective, his worst nightmare is literally manifesting in reality. But think about what's actually happening here. A bunch of British cricket players saying "Hello, Governor" to someone is just people being friendly in their cultural context. But Rigby's mind has become so warped by fear that he can't process normal social interactions. Back at the park, the paranoia escalates beyond anything regular show had shown before. Tire tracks on toilet paper, the taxi's voice coming through the phone, a fax machine printing "Hello Governor" in threatening letters. These moments are played with genuine horror movie tension, not cartoon logic. But before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, and now let's get back to the video. Here's where it gets really dark. Rigby hides in Pops' taxi, which is yellow, not British, and they drive into the woods. When they run out of gas, the British taxi emerges from the darkness like something out of a slasher film. It destroys Pops' innocent car, chases them through the forest, and eventually corners Rigby against a tree. And then something snaps. Rigby transforms from terrified victim into violent aggressor, screaming, "The name's Fitz," as he literally tears the taxi apart with his bare hands. He bites off pieces, smashes it with tree branches, completely destroys it in a berserker rage that's genuinely frightening to watch. But here's the twist that changes everything. None of it was real. The British taxi was just a video store employee in a costume trying to collect an overdue rental fee. Rigby had a complete psychotic break, hit his head, and violently assaulted an innocent worker just doing his job. The episode ends with Rigby apparently cured, dreaming of himself as Fist driving the British taxi through space. "They say this city's pretty tough," he says, "but I'm tougher." The taxi's license plate reads Fists. He hasn't conquered his fear, he's become the thing he was afraid of. Now, if this was just a one-off weird episode, we could write it off as the creators experimenting with psychological horror. But here's where the conspiracy gets real. This exact pattern repeats throughout the entire series, and I mean exactly. Let me show you what I mean. Remember Excellent? Rigby sees a commercial for an eating challenge, becomes immediately obsessed with winning a trucker hat, ignores all warnings about the dangers, pushes himself past rational limits, and nearly dies from an allergic reaction. The setup is identical to Hello Governor. Rigby encounters media content that triggers an obsession, refuses to listen to reasonable advice, and escalates the situation until it becomes life-threatening. But here's the really disturbing part. In Excellent, when Rigby wakes up from his coma, he immediately wants to try another challenge. "Dude, I'll eat the steak if you eat the eggs," he says, seeing a commercial for a steak-eating contest. He's learned nothing. The pattern that started in Hello Governor, obsession leading to breakdown leading to the wrong lesson learned, repeats exactly. The night owl follows the same blueprint, but cranks up the consequences. Rigby hears about a radio contest, becomes obsessed with winning a car, refuses to back down when things get complicated, gets manipulated by someone exploiting his paranoia, and ends up frozen for thousands of years. The night owl tells him his friends are planning to betray him, and Rigby immediately believes it without question, just like he believed the taxi was real without considering alternatives. What's particularly revealing about the night owl is how the manipulation works. The radio host doesn't have to lie extensively, he just plants seeds of doubt that exploit Rigby's existing paranoia and competitive instincts. This is identical to how the British taxi haunts Rigby, not through supernatural power, but by exploiting psychological vulnerabilities that were already there. Busted Cart shows the pattern from a different angle. Rigby's reckless behavior with the golf cart creates a crisis that threatens Benson's job. When told to stay away and let Benson handle it, Rigby can't accept this. He stows away in Benson's truck, convinced he can help, despite being explicitly told not to. His good intentions and his psychological compulsions work at cross purposes, making the situation exponentially worse. The episode shows how Rigby's need to be involved, to prove himself. To fix things often makes him the problem rather than the solution. This connects directly back to Hello Governor, where Rigby's insistence on watching the horror movie, despite his known sensitivity to scary content, creates the entire crisis. Rigby's body might be the most revealing episode in terms of understanding the Hello Governor pattern. Rigby's refusal to listen to reasonable advice about his diet causes his own body to literally abandon him in disgust. His consciousness is ejected from his physical form because he's so unwilling to accept that his behavior is destructive. What's particularly relevant is how Rigby responds to this catastrophic health crisis. Even after his body has literally left him, he continues insisting that he was right all along. "Haha, who's the loser now, Mordecai?" he says from inside a trash bucket. "Dude, in your face! I was right. My stomach doesn't even hurt anymore." He treats his complete physical breakdown as vindication of his eating habits rather than evidence that he needs to change. This is exactly what happens at the end of Hello Governor. Rigby's violent breakdown and assault on an innocent worker is reframed in his mind as a triumph. He conquered his fear by becoming violent and delusional, but he experiences this as personal growth rather than psychological deterioration. But let me take you even deeper into this conspiracy, because I think there's another layer that most people miss completely. I've been studying the visual symbolism in Hello Governor, and there are details that suggest the creators knew exactly what they were doing. Look at the taxi itself. It's not just any car, it's specifically a British taxi, a symbol of civilization and public service. Taxis are supposed to help people get where they need to go safely. But in the movie, this helpful vehicle becomes a weapon of revenge. The taxi represents what happens when something meant to help becomes corrupted by trauma and anger. Now think about Rigby throughout the series. He's supposed to be Mordecai's friend and work partner, someone who helps make life more fun and interesting. But his psychological issues consistently transform him from helper into problem. Just like the taxi, Rigby's fundamental nature gets corrupted by his inability to process challenges healthily. The British accent is crucial too. Throughout regular show, British characters are often portrayed as sophisticated, proper, and in control. The taxi's Hello Governor greeting should be friendly and welcoming. But Rigby's paranoid mind transforms this polite greeting into a threatening declaration. He can't distinguish between genuine friendliness and potential danger because his fear has completely warped his perception. This connects to a broader pattern in Rigby's character, his tendency to interpret neutral or positive situations as threats. In Excellent, a restaurant challenge meant to be fun becomes a life or death battle. In The Night Owl, a radio contest meant to be entertaining becomes a frozen nightmare lasting millennia. In Busted Cart, a simple car repair becomes a high-speed chase through the most dangerous highway in the country. The pattern is always the same. Rigby encounters something that should be manageable or even enjoyable, but his psychological issues transform it into an existential crisis. The British taxi is haunting himself by projecting his own capacity for destruction onto external symbols. But here's where it gets really meta, and this is the part of the conspiracy that I think even the creators might not have fully realized at the time. Hello Governor is about the nature of media consumption itself and how fictional narratives can colonize our internal reality. Think about what literally happens in the episode. Rigby watches a piece of media that completely warps his perception of reality. He becomes so absorbed in the narrative that it starts controlling his behavior in the real world. He can't distinguish between the fictional taxi and actual taxis. The movie's catchphrase becomes a trigger that sends him into panic attacks. The film's visual imagery starts appearing in his everyday environment. This is essentially a horror story about how consuming media can become psychologically destructive when we're not equipped to process it healthily. But here's the really creepy part. Regular Show itself is a piece of media that many fans consume obsessively. The show encourages identification with characters who consistently make terrible decisions and face supernatural consequences. What if Hello Governor was the creators' way of examining their own relationship with their audience? What if they were worried about fans who might identify too strongly with Rigby's self-destructive patterns? The episode could be read as a warning about the dangers of consuming entertainment that glorifies impulsive, destructive behavior. But let's go even deeper, because I think there's a hidden timeline element that nobody talks about. I've been analyzing the placement of these psychological breakdown episodes throughout the series, and they're not random. They're strategically positioned to show Rigby's gradual character development, or lack thereof. Hello Governor, Season 2, Episode 1, establishes the pattern. Excellent, Season 3, Episode 17, shows the pattern intensifying and nearly killing him. The Night Owl, Season 2, Episode 22, shows how the pattern affects his relationships with others. Busted Cart, Season 3, Episode 26, shows how the pattern creates external consequences for people he cares about. Rigby's Body, Season 1, Episode 11. Wait, this one's actually earlier in the timeline. Hold up, Rigby's Body aired before Hello Governor, but it follows the same psychological pattern. What if Hello Governor wasn't the first episode to establish this pattern? What if it was the episode that explained a pattern that was already there? Let me re-examine Rigby's Body with this in mind. Rigby becomes obsessed with eating free snacks at the snack bar, ignores Mordecai's warnings about the health consequences, doubles down when he starts feeling sick, and ultimately has such a severe breakdown that his consciousness literally separates from his body. The pattern is identical, but we see it from a different angle. In Rigby's Body, the breakdown is portrayed as surreal comedy, his body walking around independently while his consciousness lives in a bucket, but the underlying psychology is deadly serious. Rigby's refusal to accept that his behavior is destructive leads to complete physical collapse. What if the entire series is actually structured around Rigby's psychological breakdown cycles, with Hello Governor serving as the Rosetta Stone that helps us decode what's really happening in all the other episodes? What if Regular Show is actually a long story about someone dealing with serious mental health problems over time? This would explain why so many episodes follow similar patterns, why Rigby rarely seems to learn from his mistakes, and why the consequences keep escalating throughout the series. It's not that the writers were running out of ideas, they were documenting the progression of a serious mental health condition. But here's the most disturbing part of this conspiracy. I think Rigby might be aware of his own patterns on some level, and he keeps triggering them deliberately. Think about it. In Hello Governor, he specifically chooses to watch a horror movie despite knowing he can't handle scary content. In Excellent, he chooses to attempt an eating challenge despite being allergic to eggs. In The Night Owl, he chooses to enter a contest that requires prolonged physical endurance despite having no relevant skills. These aren't accidents. These are someone deliberately putting themselves in situations where they know they'll fail catastrophically. But why would someone do that? I think Rigby is addicted to the breakdown and recovery cycle. The psychological intensity, the drama, the way people rally around him during crises, the sense of accomplishment when he conquers his fears, even though he's not actually growing or changing. He's addicted to the feeling of overcoming obstacles, even if he has to create the obstacles himself. This would explain why he never actually learns from these experiences. Learning would mean the cycle stops, and stopping the cycle would mean losing his primary source of psychological stimulation and external validation. He needs to keep creating crises because crisis management has become his identity. Elo Governor shows us this cycle in its purest form. Rigby creates a psychological crisis by choosing inappropriate media, escalates it by refusing help, reaches a breaking point through violent action, and then reframes the entire experience as personal growth and empowerment. But he hasn't actually grown, he's just reset the cycle and prepared for the next iteration. The final dream sequence where he's driving the taxi through space is a symbol of preparation. He's literally taking control of the vehicle that represents his own self-destructive patterns. He's not planning to stop the cycle, he's planning to drive it himself. This interpretation makes regular show incredibly dark, but also incredibly sophisticated. What looks like random cartoon chaos is actually a carefully structured exploration of addiction, self-sabotage, and the psychological patterns that keep people trapped in destructive cycles. And here's the really terrifying part. I think the pattern might be spreading to other characters. Mordecai has his own breakdown episodes that follow similar structures. Muscle Man's competitive obsessions, Pops' naive trust, even Benson's explosive anger, they all seem to follow psychological patterns that mirror Rigby's breakdown cycles. What if Elo Governor wasn't just predicting Rigby's future? What if it was revealing something toxic about the entire regular show universe? What if everyone in this world is trapped in their own version of the British taxi cycle, creating psychological crises they can't escape because they've become addicted to the drama? I've been rewatching the entire series with this framework, and it changes everything. Episodes that seemed like random supernatural adventures start looking like psychological case studies. Characters that seemed like cartoon archetypes start looking like people struggling with serious mental health issues. But maybe that's the point. Maybe regular show was always a show about people who are fundamentally broken, trying to function in a world that doesn't make sense, using fantasy and adventure and supernatural chaos as coping mechanisms for psychological problems they can't address directly. And Elo Governor is the key that unlocks this reading. It's the episode that shows us how the coping mechanisms become part of the problem, how the fantasy solutions create real-world consequences, and how the cycle of breakdown and false recovery can become a prison that looks like personal growth. Once you see it this way, you can't unsee it. And that might be the most disturbing discovery of all. Regular show wasn't just entertainment. It was a documentary about psychological patterns that many of us recognize in ourselves. The British taxi isn't just haunting Rigby, it's haunting all of us, disguised as our own self-destructive habits and addictive thought patterns. So the next time you watch Elo Governor, don't just see it as the weird, creepy episode. See it as the master key to understanding one of the most psychologically complex animated series ever created. Because once you realize what this episode was really doing, regular show stops being a cartoon and starts being a mirror. And mirrors, as we all know, can show us things we weren't prepared to see. Now we will talk about the worst episode in every Adventure Time season. Adventure Time is a show that's known for its creativity, humor, and surprisingly deep themes that resonate with people of all ages. But not every episode is a winner. Some feel lazy or forced. Others cross the line from funny to uncomfortable, and a few are just straight up boring. Like the time Jake refused to help his friend while he was in real danger, or when things got weird and gross with a creepy dating lesson, or when a boring mystery turned out to be caused by birds acting like birds. These episodes feel like filler, or like they just didn't know what to do with the characters. But before we begin, make sure you're subscribed. Adventure Time Pilot, the original Adventure Time animated short from 2007, which served as the pilot for what would eventually become the beloved series, holds a disappointing 6/6 rating on IMDb, and is surprisingly underwhelming when you actually watch it today. While many fans treat this pilot as some kind of sacred beginning to their favorite show, the truth is that it's a rough, unpolished mess that barely resembles the Adventure Time we all came to love. After sitting through its awkward 11 minutes, it's honestly shocking that Cartoon Network saw enough potential here to greenlight an entire series. Let me tell you what actually happens in this pilot episode, because it's way more basic than you'd expect. The story opens with Penn, who later becomes Finn, sleeping under a tree while Jake floats around claiming he can connect his mind to the internet and download dances. Right from the start, this feels incredibly forced and try-hard. Like the creators were desperately throwing random quirky ideas at the wall, hoping something would stick. The whole internet connection concept makes absolutely no sense and feels like lazy writing designed to sound weird without any real purpose or logic behind it. The plot itself is painfully simple and boring. Princess Bubblegum gets kidnapped by the Ice King, and Pen and Jake have to go rescue her. That's literally the entire story. There's no depth, no interesting character development, no clever twists, and no real stakes that make you care about what happens next. They encounter some random enemies like an Iceclops and Snow Golem, throw snowballs at everything they see, and somehow manage to win through pure dumb luck rather than any actual skill or cleverness. The most ridiculous and nonsensical moment comes when Pen gets frozen by the Ice King and his mind supposedly gets transported back in time and to Mars, where he randomly meets Abraham Lincoln. This scene is so completely disconnected and absurd that it destroys any immersion you might have built up. Lincoln gives Pen the most generic advice possible, "I believe in yourself," and then Pen magically breaks free from the ice block. It feels like the writers painted themselves into a corner and couldn't figure out how to resolve the conflict, so they just threw in whatever bizarre random idea popped into their heads. What really bothers me about this pilot is how flat and one-dimensional all the characters feel throughout. Pen acts like every generic cartoon hero kid you've ever seen, with no real personality beyond being brave and good. Jake exists purely to make random jokes and grow big whenever it's convenient for the plot. The Ice King is just a boring villain who steals princesses because that's what the story needs him to do. Princess Bubblegum barely speaks at all and only exists to be rescued, which feels especially dated and problematic when you watch it now. Even the voice acting feels completely wrong throughout the entire episode. None of the main voice actors from the actual Adventure Time series appear in this pilot, and you can really hear the difference. Everyone sounds stiff, unnatural, and uncomfortable, like they're reading their lines for the very first time without understanding who their characters are supposed to be. It makes the whole thing feel amateurish and completely disconnected from what the show eventually became. The animation quality is noticeably cheap and rushed too. All the character designs look off and wrong. Pen's hat is weirdly rounded instead of the iconic shape we know. Jake looks bloated and strange, and the Ice King's beard is tiny and pointy instead of the flowing design from later episodes. The backgrounds feel empty and lifeless, completely lacking the detailed, lived-in quality that made the actual series so visually appealing and immersive. Everything looks like it was produced on the smallest possible budget, with very little time for any kind of polish or refinement. Most frustrating of all, this pilot completely fails to establish what eventually made Adventure Time truly special and beloved by millions of fans. The real series succeeded because it perfectly balanced silly random humor with genuine emotional depth and complex character relationships that felt real and meaningful. This pilot has absolutely none of that heart, substance, or emotional resonance. It's just random events happening to cardboard cutout characters who never feel like actual people you could care about. Looking back now, it's honestly surprising that anyone at Cartoon Network saw enough potential in this rough, unpolished pilot to justify spending money on an entire series. The pilot was rough and unpolished, but it's nothing compared to Season 2's Slow Love, which took things in a much worse direction. Slow Love from Season 2 of Adventure Time, which was rated 6.5 on IMDb, is actually a pretty terrible episode that gets way too much credit from fans who confuse weird with good. While some people think it's unique and memorable, the truth is it's just gross, repetitive, and uncomfortable to watch. The 6.5 rating it received is honestly too generous. This episode represents everything that can go wrong when Adventure Time tries too hard to be bizarre without having any real substance behind it. Let's look at what actually happens in this episode. A giant slug named Snorlock breaks into Finn and Jake's treehouse, destroys their home, and starts spraying sad juice, which is basically slug slime, all over them because he's lonely and wants a girlfriend. Instead of kicking him out for wrecking their house, Finn and Jake decide to help this destructive creature find love. The whole episode is basically them trying to teach Snorlock how to talk to female snails, which leads to increasingly gross and uncomfortable situations. The most disturbing part comes when Jake transforms into a female snail to role-play dating scenarios with Finn. Jake starts making sexual comments about mating with snails, and tells Finn he smells good like rainbows and cupcakes. This scene is so uncomfortable that even Finn gets grossed out and tries to quit multiple times. When they switch roles, Jake becomes even more aggressive and creepy, sniffing Finn and asking if he bathed in rainbows and cupcakes. This is just weird and inappropriate. Then Snorlock tries to copy Jake's terrible pickup lines with real female snails. He asks if he can smell them more, and whether they took baths. which obviously creeps out every female snail he approaches. Instead of learning that this behavior is wrong, the episode rewards Snorlock when he starts beatboxing with swords, which suddenly attracts a huge crowd of female snails who start grinding on him and making out with him. The episode gets even worse when all these female snails start having what's basically an orgy on top of Finn and Jake's treehouse, destroying their home even more. The boys have to use salt to burn Snorlock and get him to stop, which causes all the female snails to laugh at him for being naked. Finally, it's revealed that Snorlock is actually a slug, not a snail, and he finds another slug to make out with right next to the boys' destroyed house. This episode fails on multiple levels because it mistakes gross-out humor for genuine comedy and treats really problematic behavior as cute and romantic. The whole premise teaches terrible lessons about relationships, that persistence and inappropriate sexual comments will eventually work if you just add some talent to the mix. Snorlock literally destroys Finn and Jake's home twice, sexually harasses multiple women, and refuses to take no for an answer, but the episode treats him like a sympathetic character who deserves love. The role-playing scenes between Finn and Jake are genuinely uncomfortable to watch because they involve sexual themes that feel completely inappropriate for a kids' show. Jake's behavior during these scenes is creepy and predatory, and the fact that the episode plays this for laughs shows how tone-deaf the writers were. When Snorlock copies this behavior with real female snails, it becomes even more disturbing because we're watching sexual harassment being portrayed as awkward but harmless. The episode also has serious pacing problems because it keeps repeating the same jokes over and over. How many times do we need to watch Snorlock fail at talking to female snails? How many times do we need to see him spray slime everywhere? The repetitive nature that some fans call memorable is actually just lazy writing that doesn't know when to move the story forward. Even the ending is terrible because it rewards all of Snorlock's bad behavior. He gets the girl, he doesn't learn any real lessons, and Finn and Jake are left to rebuild their destroyed home while listening to Snorlock make out loudly right next to them. The episode tries to present this as a happy ending, but it's actually pretty depressing when you think about it. The 6.5 rating this episode received shows that even fans recognize it's not very good, but somehow it still gets defended as unique and memorable. Just because something is weird doesn't make it good. The fact that Cartoon Network kept replaying this episode doesn't mean it was popular. It probably just means they had limited content to fill time slots. Slow Love is gross, repetitive, uncomfortable, and teaches terrible lessons about relationships. It's exactly the kind of episode that gives Adventure Time a bad reputation for being inappropriate and poorly written. Instead of celebrating this episode as unique, fans should recognize it for what it really is, a failed experiment that completely missed the mark. While Slow Love is gross and uncomfortable, the next section shows how Apple Thief is just plain boring and pointless. Apple Thief. Apple Thief, from Season 3 of Adventure Time, which was rated 6.7 on IMDb, is a boring, pointless episode that completely wastes everyone's time with a mystery so simple that even a 5-year-old could solve it. This episode proves that Adventure Time can be incredibly dull when it forgets what makes the show actually entertaining. The whole thing feels like filler content that was thrown together just to meet episode quotas, and it's honestly shocking that this made it past the writer's room. The plot is painfully basic and offers absolutely nothing interesting. Tree Trunks discovers that someone stole all her apples, so she can't make apple pie anymore. Finn and Jake decide to help her find the thieves by going into the dark side of the Candy Kingdom, which sounds way more exciting than it actually island. They end up in some candy tavern where they pretend to be tough guys by rubbing dirt on themselves in a bathroom, which is supposed to be funny, but just comes across as stupid and childish. The whole investigation is a complete joke because there's literally no real mystery here. They find some candy thugs who call diamonds apples, which leads to this whole confusing subplot about rival gangs fighting over stolen diamonds. But this has nothing to do with Tree Trunks' actual apple problem. The episode wastes tons of time on these irrelevant gang characters who add nothing to the story and disappear as soon as their scenes are over. Then they discover that all of Tree Trunks' apples were actually hidden in her own closet, which makes her think she's the thief and call the police on herself. This is where the episode gets really ridiculous because Tree Trunks acts like she committed some terrible crime when she obviously didn't steal her own apples. The whole thing makes no sense and just drags on forever while everyone acts confused about something incredibly obvious. The solution to this mystery is embarrassingly simple. It turns out that magpies were stealing the apples from Tree Trunks' trees and accidentally dropping them through a hole in her roof into her closet. That's it. That's the big reveal. Birds were being birds and dropping food by accident. This is the most boring explanation possible for what should have been an exciting adventure. The episode completely fails because it takes a simple problem and pretends it's more complicated than it actually island. Instead of having Finn and Jake go on a real adventure or encounter interesting magical creatures, they spend the whole time talking to boring candy people in a tavern and getting confused by gang slang. There's no action, no real danger, and no character development whatsoever. What makes this episode even more frustrating is how it wastes Tree Trunks as a character. Instead of showing her being smart or resourceful, she just acts helpless and confused the entire time. She literally calls the police to arrest herself for a crime she didn't commit, which makes her look stupid rather than sympathetic. When she breaks out of handcuffs at the end and slaps a banana guard's butt, it feels completely random and out of place. The Candy Gang subplot is completely pointless and adds nothing to the story. These characters show up, fight each other for no clear reason, and then disappear forever. The whole thing about diamonds being called apples is supposed to be this clever twist, but it just makes everything more confusing without being funny or interesting. Jake mentions his criminal past about stealing bikes and purses, but this doesn't lead anywhere meaningful either. The episode also has serious pacing problems because it keeps jumping between the boring investigation and the irrelevant gang fights. Nothing flows naturally, and every scene feels disconnected from the others. By the time Finn figures out the magpie solution, you've completely lost interest in whether Tree Trunks gets her apples back. Adventure Time is supposed to be creative, magical, and emotionally engaging, but Apple Thief delivers none of these qualities. It's just a dull detective story that could happen in any normal town, with no fantasy elements or creative twists that make the Land of Ooh special. The 6. 7/10 rating is actually too generous for an episode that feels like it was written in about 10 minutes without any real thought or effort. Apple Thief proves that even good shows can produce terrible episodes when they run out of ideas and resort to the most basic, boring plots possible. It's the kind of episode that makes you want to skip ahead to something actually worth watching. While Apple Thief was boring and pointless, Gotcha is just annoying and full of cringe. Gotcha! Gotcha! From Season 4 of Adventure Time, which was rated 6, 8/10 on IMDb is a frustrating, uncomfortable episode that completely misses the mark. While some fans try to defend it as character development, the truth is that this episode is just an annoying showcase of Lumpy Space Princess being selfish, manipulative, and creepy for 11 straight minutes. The biggest problem with this episode is that it makes Lumpy Space Princess completely unlikable. She shows up at Finn and Jake's house uninvited, lies about a job opening that doesn't exist, takes over their table as her desk, and immediately starts demanding food. When Finn politely offers her blueberries and crackers, she rejects them and tries to seduce him into finding something better. She literally rubs her body against him and acts sexually suggestive to manipulate him into getting leftover spaghetti. This behavior is predatory and weird, especially since Finn is just a kid. Throughout their adventure, Lumpy Space Princess continues being selfish and useless. She complains about carrying rocks, drops them when she gets tired, and takes phone calls in the middle of their mission. When they reach the Lock of Phantoms, instead of helping with their actual quest, she tries to expose herself to get Finn's attention. She keeps trying to distract him with weird behavior while he's focused on completing an important task for Princess Bubblegum. The mirror scene is supposed to be the climax, but it's just confusing and pointless. Lumpy Space Princess gets trapped in a room full of mirrors that create evil shadow versions of Finn with long hair and no shirts. She thinks her powerful lumps turned Finn into a monster, which doesn't make any sense and isn't explained properly. Finn and Jake have to save her from these shadow creatures, but the whole sequence feels random and disconnected from the rest of the episode. The worst part is the ending, where the episode tries to present Lumpy Space Princess's behavior as sweet and romantic. After spending the entire episode annoying Finn and lying to his face, she suddenly realizes that Finn has the hottest lumps, but his lumps are on the inside. This is supposed to be her big character growth moment, but it doesn't excuse all the terrible things she did. She still lied, manipulated, and made everyone uncomfortable for her own selfish project. The episode also completely wastes Finn and Jake as characters. Instead of going on an interesting adventure or having meaningful interactions, they just react to Lumpy Space Princess's annoying behavior. Finn spends most of the episode being oblivious to her attempts at seduction, which is supposed to be funny, but just makes him look dense. Jake barely does anything except make disgusted faces and carry rocks. Even the moral of the episode is problematic because it suggests that Lumpy Space Princess learned something valuable, but she didn't really change her behavior. She still lied to Finn and Jake about being their secretary, she still wrote a book about them without permission, and she still acted selfishly throughout the entire experience. The fact that she ends up writing a different book doesn't make her actions any less manipulative or wrong. The 6/8 rating on IMDb shows that even Adventure Time fans recognize this episode as below average. It lacks the creativity, heart, and genuine humor that makes the show special. Instead of exploring interesting fantasy concepts or developing characters in meaningful ways, it just focuses on one character being annoying and inappropriate for 11 minutes. Adventure Time works best when it balances weird humor with genuine emotion and creative storytelling. Gotcha! Fails at all of these elements because it's too focused on Lumpy Space Princess's selfish scheme to create anything truly entertaining or meaningful. It's exactly the kind of episode that gives the show a bad reputation for being random and pointless without any real substance behind the weirdness. While Gotcha was a cringe episode with selfish Lumpy Space Princess, the next part is all about the messy romance in love games. But before I tell you about mess, make sure to subscribe the channel, and now let's get back to the video. Love Games. Love Games from Season 5 of Adventure Time is a deeply uncomfortable and disappointing episode that completely deserves its mediocre 6/7 rating on IMDb. This episode represents everything that can go wrong when Adventure Time tries to force romantic storylines without understanding what makes relationships actually interesting or meaningful. The first major problem is how the episode treats Finn's obvious discomfort as comedy. Throughout the entire episode, Finn clearly doesn't want to be in these romantic situations, but everyone keeps pushing him anyway. During the spooning challenge, Slime Princess literally chases Finn around a mattress, trying to force him to cuddle with her while he screams, "No!" This is disturbing and inappropriate. The episode seems to think that watching a teenage boy get pressured into fake intimacy is hilarious, which shows how tone-deaf the writers were. The love games themselves are incredibly stupid and serve no real purpose beyond creating awkward moments. The crooning challenge has couples singing love songs on swan boats, which Finn wins by singing about his depression over Flame Princess. The spooning challenge involves cuddling on mattresses while Elder Plops judges their love, which is just weird and uncomfortable. The final smooching challenge never happens because both Finn and Slime Princess vomit when they try to kiss, which should tell you everything about how forced this relationship island. Blargatha's subplot with the fake husband Guillermo is equally pointless and poorly executed. The big reveal that Guillermo is just a blob of slime with olives for eyes comes completely out of nowhere and doesn't make any sense. Blargatha's explanation that she's too hot to find real love is shallow and doesn't justify her elaborate plan to take over the world with slime tanks. Once they discover Guillermo is fake, the entire military conquest threat just disappears, making the whole setup feel meaningless. The episode completely wastes its setting and potential for creative world building. The Slime Kingdom could have been this fascinating, unique environment, but instead it's just a gross wasteland with a random disco where Tree Trunks and Mr. Pig show up for no reason. Everything feels disconnected and thrown together instead of carefully crafted like the show's better episodes. What makes this episode especially frustrating is how it undermines Finn's character development. The episode begins with Finn declaring that he's done with dating and wants to focus on adventuring, which could have been meaningful growth after his painful breakup with Flame Princess. But instead of exploring this decision or showing him learning to be comfortable being single, the episode immediately forces him back into romantic situations that make him miserable and teach him nothing. The humor throughout falls completely flat because it relies on awkward sexual tension and uncomfortable situations instead of the clever wordplay and imaginative scenarios that make Adventure Time funny. Jake's terrible puns about tanking and getting out in the lick of time feel forced and desperate. The whole episode seems like it was written by people who don't understand what makes relationships or comedy actually work. The ending is particularly unsatisfying because nothing is resolved in any meaningful way. Slime Princess keeps her kingdom, but only because her sister was disqualified for cheating. Finn doesn't learn anything about love or relationships. Both characters end up vomiting when they try to kiss, which supposedly shows they're not right for each other, but the episode doesn't explore what that means or why it happened. Adventure Time works best when it balances silly humor with genuine emotion and creative storytelling. Love Games fails at all these elements because it's too focused on creating uncomfortable romantic situations without any real purpose or emotional payoff. The 6/7 rating reflects that even dedicated fans recognize this as one of the show's weaker efforts that doesn't live up to its usual standards of creativity and heart. While Love Games was awkward and didn't work, the next part, Water Park Prank, was the lowest rated episode in Adventure Time. Water Park Prank. Water Park Prank from Season 6 of Adventure Time is just awful and totally deserves its terrible 4.8 rating on IMDb. This episode is proof that being different doesn't make something good, it just makes it weird and hard to watch. The biggest problem is how the episode looks. Instead of Adventure Time's normal beautiful animation, this episode uses this strange computer animation that makes everything look cheap and fake. All the characters move like paper dolls being pushed around on a screen. Finn and Jake don't even look like themselves anymore. They look like bad copies from some low-budget cartoon. The animation is so ugly and distracting that you can't enjoy anything else about the episode. The story is really simple and boring. Finn and Jake go to a water park where they see Ice King. Instead of leaving him alone, they decide to play a mean prank on him. Jake blocks a water slide by making himself big inside it, so every time Ice King tries to slide down, he bounces back up. They keep doing this until Ice King gets angry and starts a fight. Then the lifeguards kick him out and ban him from the water park forever. This story is just cruel and not funny at all. Ice King wasn't doing anything wrong. He just wanted to have a nice day at the water park. He even told Finn and Jake that he didn't want any trouble. But they decided to mess with him anyway because they thought it would be fun. This makes Finn and Jake look like bullies instead of heroes. Watching an old man get embarrassed and banned from somewhere he was enjoying is just sad. The prank is just the same thing happening over and over again. Ice King slides down, bounces back up, gets confused, and tries again. We watched this happen like 5 times. The episode thinks this repetition is hilarious, but it's actually just boring. Good comedy needs surprise and cleverness, not just doing the same gag repeatedly. There's also this weird side story about Finn getting infected with things called daddy sad heads. These are supposed to be parasites that make you too sad to get rid of them. Princess Bubblegum helps Finn by telling him to pretend they're jingle bells instead. This works right away, which makes the whole problem seem pointless. Then, at the end, Finn gets infected again, so nothing was accomplished. This subplot feels like it was only added to make the episode longer. The water park setting is completely wasted too. Adventure Time usually takes boring places and makes them magical and interesting, but this water park is just normal and bland. There are slides, lockers, and showers, that's it. No weird creatures, no magical properties, no creative details that make you think, wow, this is cool. It's just a regular water park that could exist in any cartoon. Adventure Time is usually great because it mixes silly humor with real emotions and character growth. Even the funny episodes usually teach us something about friendship or help the characters learn and change. But Water Park Prank has none of that depth. Nobody learns anything, nobody grows as a person, and nothing meaningful happens. It's just 11 minutes of watching characters be mean to each other for no good reason. The weird animation style might have been okay if it made the story better somehow. But it's obviously just an experiment that the creators wanted to try, without thinking about whether it would actually improve the episode. The result is something that looks and feels completely different from every other Adventure Time episode, and not in a good way. What makes Adventure Time special is how it can be weird and creative while still having heart and meaning. Water Park Prank is weird without any purpose behind it. It's creative in ways that make the episode worse instead of better. The 4.8 rating shows that even people who love Adventure Time couldn't defend this episode. It's a perfect example of how trying something different can go completely wrong when you don't care about making it actually good. While Water Park Prank was a mess, President Porpoise is missing. Just feels pointless and random. President Porpoise is missing. President Porpoise is missing. From Season 7 of Adventure Time is honestly pretty disappointing, and that 6.7 rating on IMDb makes total sense. This episode tries way too hard to be random and funny, but there's just nothing underneath all the weird stuff. The plot follows Finn and Jake as they get interrupted during a video game by breaking news that President Porpoise has gone missing. Since Jake apparently video chats with the president sometimes, they decide to help find him before Vice President Blowfish takes over the government. They borrow Banana Man's submarine and head underwater to the Fish Parliament, where they're given 20 minutes to locate the missing leader. The big reveal at the end is that President Porpoise simply took a 3-day weekend and forgot to tell anyone about it. This ending completely undermines everything that came before it. After spending 11 minutes building up mystery and political tension, we discover there was never any real problem to solve. The president wasn't kidnapped, there's no conspiracy, and nobody did anything wrong. He just went on vacation and had poor communication skills. It's not a clever twist, it's just deflating and makes the whole adventure feel pointless. The episode tries too hard to be funny with its setup of multiple characters secretly hiding in Finn and Jake's house. First, we discover Banana Man has been watching them from behind their couch because he gets lonely. Then Ice King suddenly appears, revealing he was invisible the entire time. After they leave, even more characters emerge from various hiding spots, including Marceline and Princess Bubblegum. This gag feels forced rather than naturally funny, and the episode never explains why all these people were lurking around their house in the first place. The underwater political subplot lacks the depth and creativity that Adventure Time usually brings to its world building. The Fish Parliament is filled with sea creatures debating whether Vice President Blowfish should become president, but their political system feels arbitrary and underdeveloped. When they vote on whether Finn and Jake can help, Secretary Octopus counts all 8 of his arms as separate votes, giving the yes side a 9-8 victory. While this could have been a clever joke about underwater democracy, it just comes across as random rather than thoughtful. Vice President Blowfish is presented as a potential antagonist, with Finn openly suspecting him of orchestrating the president's disappearance. But this suspicion leads nowhere because Blowfish was just doing his constitutional duty as vice president. There's no real conflict or mystery to unravel, which makes the political drama feel hollow and unnecessary. The episode gets sidetracked by several subplots that don't contribute to the main story. BMO and Ice King have their own imaginary submarine adventure, while the real mission happens, with BMO playing captain and Ice King acting as a homesick soldier. This parallel story might have worked if it connected meaningfully to the main plot, but instead it just eats up screen time. Jake's claustrophobia in the real submarine could have created genuine tension, but it's mostly played for simple physical comedy when he shrinks down and gets stuck in cracks. Banana Man's sudden romance with Representative Seibel feels especially out of place. Their relationship gets a full musical sequence with 2 halves make a whole, but this romantic subplot appears from nowhere and doesn't enhance the episode's themes or story. The song tries to be emotionally resonant, but it feels disconnected from everything else happening. The most frustrating aspect is how the resolution makes everything that happened completely meaningless. Secretary Octopus reveals he had tied a string around his tentacle to remember the president's vacation but forgot to check it. This detail is supposed to be funny, but it just emphasizes how unnecessary the entire episode was. All the political tension, the underwater mission, and the 20-minute deadline were based on a simple communication error. Adventure Time typically succeeds by taking seemingly simple premises and finding deeper meaning or emotional truth within them. President Porpoise is missing! It does the opposite. It takes what could have been an interesting political mystery and reduces it to a misunderstanding that could have been solved with a phone call. The 6. 7/10 rating reflects how this episode falls short of the show's usual standards. It has all the surface elements of a good Adventure Time episode: creative characters, underwater exploration, and political intrigue, I would apply, but lacks the heart and purpose that make the series special. President Porpoise is missing, falls flat with a silly ending that makes the whole story feel useless, and 5 Short Tables is even worse with 5 random, empty stories pretending to be smart. 5 Short Tables. 5 Short Tables from Season 8 of Adventure Time has a 7/2 rating on IMDb, making it the lowest rated episode of the season, and honestly, this episode is a complete mess that tries way too hard to be smart. This whole thing fails because it takes 5 boring stories and tries to connect them with the word table, which is just lazy writing disguised as creativity. The episode starts with Ice King's penguins telling him his fanfiction sucks, so he decides to write new stories about Fiona and Cake. This setup already feels dumb because it's basically the writers making jokes about their own work instead of actually making good content. It's like they're admitting they don't have real ideas, so they're just going to throw random stuff together and hope it works. The first story shows Cake making pancakes that are supposed to tell a story, but they just look like regular pancakes. Fiona can't understand what story the pancakes are telling because they're just blobs of food, so Cake decides to make pancakes that look like real people instead. This whole idea is weird and makes no sense. Who wants their breakfast to tell them a story? It feels like someone was trying really hard to come up with something artistic, but just ended up with something confusing. In the second part, Prince Gumball plays a board game against his butler, thinking he's got the perfect plan from reading his science books. But the butler totally destroys him by revealing she's been reading his diary and knows all his secrets and fears. Watching Gumball get emotionally beaten down by his own employee isn't fun to watch, it's just mean and uncomfortable. There's no lesson learned or happy ending, just someone getting hurt for no good reason. The library story with Flame Prince and Turtle Prince is probably the most pointless of all. Flame Prince keeps accidentally burning books while Turtle Prince runs around putting out fires. The big joke is that Flame Prince only came to use the bathroom and thought he needed to check out a book first. This isn't funny or clever, it's just random weirdness that doesn't go anywhere or tell us anything interesting about these characters. The Marshall Lee and Lumpy Space Prince story is the only one that kind of works. Marshall creates a fake monster attack to trick LSP into taking cough medicine. He pretends to fight an invisible monster and dies dramatically to convince LSP to drink the medicine. It's actually sweet because it shows Marshall cares about his friend, but then it gets ruined when the medicine gives LSP weird bumps on his face because Marshall grabbed the wrong bottle. The last story has Ice Queen reading deep, philosophical stories to penguins about characters wondering if they really exist. This pretentious garbage feels completely wrong for Adventure Time, like someone was trying to sound smart without actually having anything meaningful to say. The fight between Ice Queen and Fiona is short and boring, ending with Cake putting a pancake on the Queen's face. The whole episode falls apart when Ice King explains his brilliant theme at the end. He connects all the stories because they mention tables: breakfast table, science table, table of contents, tablespoon, and tabling a conversation. This isn't smart writing, it's just word games that a kid might think is clever. It's like connecting 5 random stories because they all mention the color blue. What makes this episode extra disappointing is how it wastes the Fiona and Cake idea. Earlier gender-swapped episodes worked because they showed us familiar characters in new ways while keeping the emotional heart that makes Adventure Time good. 5 Short Tables throws away character development completely and focuses on being weird just to be weird. The short story format could have been great if each part had been a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end. Instead, we get 5 random scenes that feel like leftover ideas from other episodes. Nothing gets solved, nobody learns anything, and the stories don't connect except for the dumb table wordplay. Adventure Time became popular because it mixed crazy humor with real emotions and character growth. 5 Short Tables has the crazy part but completely misses the emotional part that made the show special. It's weird for the sake of being weird, without understanding what actually made the show's best episodes work so well. This episode feels like homework where someone had to write 5 stories using the same word, and the result is exactly as forced and fake as you'd expect. It's the kind of episode that makes you wonder if the writers were running out of good ideas and just threw something together to fill time. The forced wordplay in 5 Short Tables was bad, but Season 9's Fiona and Cake and Fiona made things even worse with confusing backstories. Fiona and Cake and Fiona. Fiona and Cake and Fiona from Season 9 of Adventure Time is a confusing mess that earned its disappointing 6.8 rating on IMDb, making it stick out like a sore thumb in what was otherwise a really strong season. While most other Season 9 episodes were doing well with much higher ratings, this one episode managed to drag down the overall quality with its convoluted storytelling and missed opportunities. The biggest problem with this episode is that it completely ruins one of Adventure Time's most charming concepts. The original Fiona and Cake episodes were special because they were clearly Ice King's innocent fanfiction about gender-swapped versions of Finn and Jake. It was sweet and funny watching Ice King create these stories as a way to cope with his loneliness. But this episode tries to explain where Fiona and Cake come from by saying they're characters from some old TV show, which makes everything way more complicated and less magical. The twist that the woman isn't really Fiona is supposed to be this big reveal, but it just makes the whole episode feel pointless. We spend most of the time watching her show videotapes of adventures that didn't even really happen, and then find out she's just a lonely old lady who's obsessed with fictional characters. This could have been interesting if it was handled better, but instead, it just feels like a waste of time. What's really frustrating is how the episode handles the meta-commentary about fanfiction and obsessive fandom. The Rabbit Lady is clearly meant to represent overly obsessed fans who get too invested in fictional characters, but the episode doesn't really have anything meaningful to say about this. She lies to Ice King, steals his stuff, and then just leaves feeling bad about herself. There's no real resolution or lesson learned. The videotape segments themselves are boring and don't feel like real Fiona and Cake adventures. They're too dull and lack the creativity and energy that made the original Fiona and Cake episodes fun to watch. The Mummy divided by Queen of Ooh subplot is particularly weak. It's just a basic stranger turns out to be a thief story that could happen in any cartoon. Ice King's characterization also feels off in this episode. He's supposed to be excited about meeting Fiona, but he comes across as more naive and gullible than usual. The episode tries to make us feel sorry for him when he gets tricked, but it's hard to care because the whole situation is so artificial and contrived. The episode also wastes Finn and Jake, who only appear briefly at the beginning and don't contribute anything meaningful to the story. Adventure Time works best when it focuses on the core relationships between its main characters, but this episode sidelines them completely in favor of exploring some convoluted backstory that nobody asked for. Even the ending feels unsatisfying. The rabbit lady realizes she's like the mummy, meaning she's a thief and liar, but this comparison doesn't really make sense and feels forced. Then we get this weird scene where a red beam shoots into Ice King's head with more Fiona and Cake content, which is supposed to explain where his stories come from, but it just adds another layer of unnecessary complexity. The 6/8 rating is particularly disappointing because Season 9 was actually doing really well overall. Most of the other episodes in the season were getting much higher ratings and positive fan reactions, which makes this episode's poor performance even more noticeable. It's like having one bad song on an otherwise great album. It really stands out and makes you wonder how it made it past quality control. This episode represents a rare misstep in what was otherwise a solid season. Instead of telling a simple, heartfelt story about friendship and imagination like the rest of Season 9, it gets bogged down in meta commentary and origin explanations that make everything less magical and more confusing. The fact that this is supposed to be a Fiona and Cake episode but barely features the real characters just makes it even more disappointing for fans who were hoping for another fun adventure in the gender-swapped world. When the rest of the season was delivering quality content, this episode really dropped the ball. While Fiona and Cake and Fiona was confusing and messy, Ring of Fire is just a boring story about Tree Trunks' love life. Ring of Fire. Ring of Fire from Season 10 of Adventure Time is one of those episodes that sounds way more interesting on paper than it actually is when you watch it. Even though it got nominated for an Emmy, many fans found it pretty disappointing and gave it a 6/7 rating, which is pretty low for Adventure Time standards. The episode focuses entirely on Tree Trunks and her romantic history, which is exactly what you'd expect from the title, referencing her past relationships. When her first husband Randy calls asking for his grandmother's ring back so he can propose to someone else, Tree Trunks starts reflecting on all her previous marriages. We get these long flashback sequences showing her relationships with Randy, Danny, A, Pirate, and Wyatt, her business partner, plus her current marriage to Mr. Pig. The biggest problem with this episode is that it completely abandons what makes Adventure Time actually good. Finn and Jake don't even appear or get mentioned, which immediately removes the heart and soul of the show. Adventure Time works best when it focuses on the core friendship between Finn and Jake, but Ring of Fire is just Tree Trunks talking about her love life for 11 minutes straight. Tree Trunks has never been a particularly compelling character to begin with. She's this overly sweet elephant who talks in a weird baby voice and constantly gets into romantic situations that are supposed to be funny but just come across as creepy. Building an entire episode around her past relationships feels like a waste of time when there are so many more interesting characters and storylines they could have explored instead. The flashback structure makes the episode feel disjointed and boring. Instead of having one coherent story, we just jump around between different time periods, watching Tree Trunks get married, leave her husbands, and move on to the next guy. Each relationship follows the same basic pattern. She meets someone, they get married quickly, something goes wrong, and she abandons them. It gets repetitive really fast. The episode tries to present Tree Trunks as this adventurous, independent woman who lived this wild life before settling down, but it doesn't really work. Her adventures mostly involve her being selfish and abandoning people when things get difficult. She leaves Randy right after their wedding, maroons Danny on an island when she discovers he lied to her, and kicks out Wyatt when he becomes too needy. None of this makes her seem cool or adventurous, it just makes her look like she's bad at relationships. Even the episode's attempts at being mature fall flat. The show's creator mentioned this was supposed to be the most sex-mad episode they ever made, but it just comes across as awkward and inappropriate. Tree Trunks running around naked on a beach and talking about tight men feels completely out of place in Adventure Time. The show works best when it keeps things innocent and focuses on friendship and growing up, not weird adult content. The ending tries to be all heartfelt and meaningful, with Tree Trunks realizing that her current life with Mr. Pig and Sweet Pea is her greatest adventure. But this moral lesson feels forced and unearned because we've just spent the whole episode watching her be terrible to everyone she's ever been with. Why should we believe she's changed when she's shown no real growth or self-reflection? Mr. Pig's jealousy subplot is also really annoying. He follows Tree Trunks to the diner because he's worried Randy wants to steal her away, then crashes through the ceiling like some kind of action hero. It's supposed to be funny, but it just makes Mr. Pig look pathetic and insecure. The fact that Tree Trunks lied to him about where she was going doesn't help either. The episode's Emmy nomination probably had more to do with the technical aspects like animation and voice acting than the actual story quality. Just because something gets nominated doesn't mean it's actually good, it just means it met certain industry standards. What really bothers me about Ring of Fire is how it represents everything wrong with Adventure Time's later seasons. Instead of focusing on the magical world building, creative adventures, and meaningful character relationships that made the early seasons great, it gets bogged down in boring adult relationship drama that nobody asked for. The 6.7 rating this episode received from fans shows that people recognized it for what it really was, a filler episode that didn't contribute anything meaningful to the Adventure Time universe. It's exactly the kind of episode you'd skip on a rewatch because it doesn't advance any important storylines or develop any characters we actually care about. If you guys enjoyed our video, make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you in the next one.